What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Fantasy Football Over Analysis. Today we're continuing our series going through the best and worst picks in every round of the draft. Today we're talking about round 5. And in round 5 in the draft, we're hitting the end of the RB2 and wide receiver 2 ranks. We're starting to hit that third tier of guys at both positions. And the thing about once you get into the wide receiver 3 and running back 3 tier is that this is usually the group of guys that really has a strong chance to outperform their ADP and be league-winning picks for you. So let's take a look at these round 5 guys and see if any of them have that league-winning potential. So right now, currently being drafted in round 5, we have David Montgomery, Davante Adams, Terry McClaurin, Tyler Warren, Treyveon Henderson, DeAndre Swift, Bayshul Tuten, Mike Evans, Drake Maye, Jameson Williams, DJ Moore, and Odunze. At the 501, we have David Montgomery, running back for the Houston Texans. Montgomery spending the last 3 years in Detroit, finishing 2 of those 3 seasons as an RB2. And Montgomery, despite being the 1B in the Detroit offense, was still able to be very productive from a fantasy standpoint during his time with the Lions, averaging over 10 touchdowns per season, and even chipping in a little in the receiving game as well, between 25 to 30 receptions. And so with the move to the Texans, Montgomery now has the opportunity to be the 1A instead of the 1B. And I think Montgomery fits so well into the Houston offense and what they're going to be trying to do. And David Montgomery is a significant improvement from any running back that the Texans were rolling out there last season. They had Nick Chubb out there on his last legs. They had rookie Woody Marks, who really should be limited to just being a passing down specialist. Montgomery can still bring a lot of juice to the table for a team's running game. The fact that he was the 1B behind Jahmyr Gibbs the last 3 seasons is a really good thing, because going into his age 29 season, Montgomery doesn't have very nearly the wear and tear that a lot of the running backs at his age do have. And I think if you want a baseline for what you could expect from David Montgomery with the Texans, just look at what Joe Mixon was able to accomplish in his only season with the Texans. Mixon 2 years ago ran for just over 1,000 yards, 11 touchdowns, and also caught 36 passes, and that was with Mixon appearing in only 14 games. He finished as the RB17 that year. Montgomery, who's currently being drafted as the RB22, finished as the RB17 and the RB19 in 2 of his 3 years in Detroit, so he was able to achieve a similar output to what Mixon was able to provide in his lone season with the Texans, but he was able to do that as a 1B option in the Lions offense behind Jahmyr Gibbs. So Montgomery here in Houston, now that he has the opportunity to be the 1A, I think at minimum is going to profile somewhere in that RB17 range, similar to what Mixon was able to do, and maybe there's upside for more. But one thing that I'm certain of with Montgomery is that he's going to outperform his RB22 ranking. So I like Montgomery at the 501. I think he's a perfectly fine fallback option as a later end RB2, where if you miss on some of the higher end options in round 2, 3, or 4, then he's a great guy that you can fall back on in the 5th round. At the 502, we have Davante Adams of the Rams, and Davante Adams, unfortunately, is going to be a fade for me this year. And for Davante, the fit with the Rams last season was just perfect. He was brought in to be this red zone monster, and that's exactly the way the Rams used him. Adams actually caught only 60 passes last year, but 14 of them, 14, went for touchdowns, meaning that almost 25% of his receptions for the season resulted in touchdowns. That, however, is a very unsustainable number, so I think Davante on his own is due for some regression, but I also think that quarterback Matt Stafford's passing numbers as a whole have to come down a bit this year as well. Stafford last season had a bit of an outlier year, throwing for 4,700 yards and 47 touchdowns. The previous 3 seasons, Stafford had not eclipsed the 4,000-yard mark, and he had not thrown for more than 24 touchdowns. So if Stafford does regress statistically this year, and his touchdown and passing yard totals come down, then that means the outlook for all of the Rams' pass catchers has to take a bit of a dip as well. So if Davante Adams' touchdown total drops from the 14 that we had last season down to, say, between 7 and 10, then that's going to be a huge blow to his fantasy value. Adams would still be playable as a flex or a wide receiver 3 play, but he would not be returning the value at the 502 that you're investing in him. Also keep in mind that Adams finished the year with hamstring issues last year, and then in the offseason, and this is a point that I don't think people have brought up enough when talking about Davante Adams, but the Rams were at one point in on the trade for A.J. Brown with the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, while the deal didn't materialize, part of that deal would have been sending Davante Adams someplace else. And the Rams are a very smart organization. They know when it's time to let go of a player. Just look at how they treated Cooper Kupp just a year ago when they brought in Davante Adams. They saw Kupp up close and personal, and they knew that he had very little left. So they were happy to let him go when it came time to upgrade and bring in Davante Adams. Same thing here. They saw Davante Adams up close throughout the season, and maybe they got to look at him managing the hamstring injury toward the end of the year, and perhaps they saw again a declining player, and if the opportunity to get a guy like A.J. Brown was possible, then they would have been happy to move off of the older Adams in order to bring in a younger, more explosive player. So with Davante Adams at the 502, there's just too many red flags here for me to be interested. Everything from his age to the possible touchdown regression from both himself and Matthew Stafford. So I'm going to be out on Adams in this range. I think he's still going to be serviceable for fantasy this year, but there's guys with much better floors and higher ceilings that you can get in this range. At the 503, we have Terry McClaurin, and McClaurin is another guy that I do not have a lot of interest in. So Terry McClaurin has always been a guy that the fantasy community loves. I think he's always been just a little bit overhyped. For one, McClaurin is a little older than I think people realize he is. He's on the wrong side of 30, and he's coming off of a season in which he struggled to stay healthy, only appearing in 10 games. And age 30 isn't ancient for a wide receiver by any means, but there are a handful of guys that once they get to that point where the injuries start to pile up, then it gets harder and harder for them to stay healthy the older they get. Look what happened to Cooper Kupp. Kupp, once he reached his age 28-29 season, was when the injuries really started to pile up and take a toll on him. It became harder and harder for him to stay on the field, and even when he did manage to get on the field, he just wasn't the same as what he was a year or two before. Some wide receivers age gracefully, some wide receivers begin their decline a little earlier than others. Terry McLaurin is in the range where a decline is possible, and it's mostly because of that I'm going to be fading him. In fantasy football, you don't want to be tied to too many aging players. There are exceptions to that rule, and we'll get into one of them in this round, actually. But for the most part, you want to be drafting younger guys that don't have a ton of mileage on them, that have yet to hit their ceilings yet. And with Terry McLaurin, I just feel like we may have already seen the best of him. I think that wide receiver 7 finish that he had 2 years ago is something that I think that was the peak, and I don't think it's something that we're going to be getting back to. It also doesn't help that Washington brought in 2 more targets for Jaden Daniels this year, signing Chigakonkwo and Stephon Diggs in free agency. Those guys are both going to eat into McLaurin's target share, so it's not like the situation was in the past where McLaurin was the only show in town and he was going to produce just because he was getting force-fed targets. So Terry McLaurin in this range is going to be someone that I pass on. I'll let my league mates take a risk on him while I go for some of the guys in this range that have much higher ceilings. At the 504, we have Tyler Warren, tight end for the Indianapolis Colts. Warren finishes as the tight end 4 in his rookie season, catching 76 passes for over 800 yards and 4 touchdowns. And Warren is a really interesting pick at the 504. I think he's a guy that's in a great position to outperform this ADP. One of the big moves that the Colts made this offseason was getting rid of Michael Pittman, a guy who had been their number 2 wide receiver, a guy who thrived on volume. And the other move the Colts made was keeping Alec Pierce. And Alec Pierce, even though he's being paid to be the number 1 receiver on this team, isn't a guy that's going to get a ton of volume. Pierce also isn't 100% healthy going into training camp, and currently there's no timetable for his return. So that leaves both Tyler Warren and Josh Downs currently as the top 2 targets for the Colts. And unless the Colts make some other addition at the wide receiver position before the start of the season, then there's no reason that we shouldn't be expecting spikes in almost every category for Warren, everything from volume to yardage and touchdown scoring itself. And Warren in this range really doesn't need to do all that much to pay off the ADP. Even if he finishes with exactly what he did a year ago in terms of both receptions and yardage, around 76 for about 800, all he really needs to do is run hot with touchdowns for him to, at minimum, finish as a top 5 tight end. But again, the situation itself is just one where Warren can't help but get a lot more volume than what he was getting a year ago. So here you have a guy who showed very well in his rookie season, that has a first-round draft pick attached to his name, that is in a position where he at minimum is going to be the number 2 option on his team, if not the number 1 option altogether. So I think Tyler Warren absolutely deserves to be in the conversation with Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, and Colston Loveland among the elite tight ends in fantasy football. He has a great combination of both floor and ceiling, and his 504 ADP is an excellent price point if you want to get into that elite tight end range, but you don't want to pay a premium for, say, a guy like Bowers or McBride, and you want to target a Luther Burden in round 4 instead of Colston Loveland in that range. Coming in at the 505, we have Treyveon Henderson, running back for the New England Patriots. And this is a case where I just think that the ADP is completely out of control. There's just so much risk to drafting Treyveon Henderson in this range. And we certainly saw last season stretches of what the upside for Treyveon Henderson can be. We saw that run from week 10 through week 15, where Henderson puts together well over 500 total yards from scrimmage and 7 total touchdowns. And that upside that we saw during that 5-week run was very similar to that of Jahmyr Gibbs on the Detroit Lions in terms of explosiveness alone. However, the big thing with Henderson, the reason that he didn't play more last season and the reason that he went back to the bench once Ramondre Stevenson was healthy was his struggles in pass protection. And plain and simple, in the NFL, it doesn't matter how talented you are at the running back position, how explosive you are, if you can't hold up in pass protection, if they can't trust you on those passing downs to keep their franchise quarterback upright, then you're not going to play. That was the case for Henderson last year, and it's going to be the case for him again this year as well. Until he learns pass protection and until the Patriots actually trust him, then he's not going to get a reliable snap share that we can trust enough to put out in our starting lineups every week. And right now, the early indications out of training camp are that he's still struggling with pass protection. So until those issues for him are cleared up and corrected, it's going to be a guy that has such an unreliable, limited role week to week that it's just impossible, I think, to draft him in this range at the 505. 8 of the 17 games last season, Henderson played below 40% of the snaps. That's not a guy that you can trust at the 505. That's not a guy that is draftable in that range. I'm 100% letting my league mates take on that headache this season, and I think we're at least another year away before we can really trust Treyveon Henderson in fantasy football. At the 506, we have DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears, and while Treyveon Henderson, one pick earlier at the 505, is one of the riskiest picks that you can possibly make in fantasy football, DeAndre Swift is very much the polar opposite. He's one of the safest picks that you can make at the running back position. Swift's fantasy resume speaks for itself. He has been an RB2 literally every single year of his NFL career. Last season, he finishes as the RB15 with just over 1,000 yards on the ground and 10 total touchdowns. And with Swift, you know he's tied to a good offense, playing under Ben Johnson, one of the best play callers and offensive minds in the league. You also know that he's going to contribute in the receiving game as well. He's a lock to catch between 35 to 50 receptions, which also really helps out his floor. And being priced as the RB24, it's very likely that he's going to exceed that ADP and finish somewhere in the middle of the RB2 ranks, somewhere between the RB15, 16, 17 range. So with Swift, you know it's a pick that you're going to get a return and exceed on the value that you're selecting him at. The only issue with Swift is that while the floor is as safe as they come, there really isn't a ceiling there that he has that he can hit. We know that he's going to cap out as an RB2. There really isn't much of a path for Swift to get into the RB1 ranks. But there really is something to be said for a guy that has as safe of a floor as Swift, a guy that you know you can count on to go out and produce at least 15 fantasy points for you on any given week, with a little bit of upside to occasionally get into the 20s. Another major point in the case for drafting DeAndre Swift is just how safe his finishes were week to week. There were only 4 games in total last year that Swift finished outside of the RB2 ranks. So DeAndre Swift really just such an underrated pick to make in fantasy football. While he might not have the ceiling to finish as an RB1, the floor that he gives you week to week I think is just so underrated, and I think that he absolutely can be a winning piece on your fantasy football team. Coming in at the 507, we have Bayshul Tuten of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So Bayshul Tuten in his rookie season gets really limited opportunity behind Travis Etienne as the Jaguars' RB2. Tuten made the most of those opportunities though, coming away with 7 total touchdowns despite a really limited role in his rookie season. Now with Etienne gone, Tuten has an opportunity to emerge as the lead runner in this Jacksonville offense. The problem though is that the Jaguars seem to be intent on using a committee in their backfield. They go out this offseason and they sign Chris Rodriguez from the Commanders, who Liam Cohen, the head coach, has some familiarity with. and Chris Rodriguez last season, we saw how annoying he was playing in front of Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt in Washington. Rodriguez much more of a plotter and a guy that the Jaguars want to use a lot in the goal line, which I don't fully understand because Bayshul Tuten was used a lot in short yardage opportunities, and he seemed to thrive with them last season. And then the team also has LaQuint Allen, another second-year running back who's primarily a passing down specialist. And Allen, not a guy that's going to take a big share of the snaps away from Tuten, but still enough that it's probably going to be annoying when Allen is coming out there for third down work and 2-minute drill situations above Tuten. So Tuten is a guy that I want to be in on this year, but I can't ignore the fact that the Jaguars really seem intent on doing this running back by committee thing. And there's a couple ways to look at this situation. On the positive side of things, you could compare this very much to what it was for Chase Brown with the Bengals a couple of years ago. The Bengals went into that season with both Brown and Zach Moss in their backfield, and for whatever reason, the Bengals were just hell-bent on using Zach Moss as their primary running back, and Moss just offering absolutely zero upside week to week. It wasn't until he finally goes down for the season with an injury midway through the year that Brown finally got his opportunity to be unleashed, and he ran away with the job, sure enough, and the Bengals haven't looked back ever since. And maybe that's similar to what's going to happen with Tuten this year. Maybe we start out the year with the frustrating committee split with Rodriguez and LaQuint Allen both mixing in and taking away valuable goal line touches and receiving work from Tuten. Meanwhile, Tuten gets the work in between the 20s, but doesn't get the high-value touches, and it becomes a frustrating thing throughout the first half of the year. But then, maybe as the year goes on, Tuten starts to separate himself more and more from the rest of these guys and becomes more valuable as the season goes along. But then you also have the scenario where the frustrating committee exists and it just lasts the whole year and it just is what it is. And it becomes a situation very similar to what you have in Tampa Bay, where Bucky Irving is the guy between the 20s, but then Kenneth Gainwell is coming in to be the receiving back, and Sean Tucker is coming in the Rodriguez role to be the goal line back. And you just get a situation where Bayshul Tuten isn't paying off this 5th round ADP. And so while I want to be in on Tuten, and I would certainly take him over a guy like Treyveon Henderson right now, I don't think that I would draft him over the safety of DeAndre Swift and what I know that I can get from a pick like that, where I know with Swift I can get between 15 to 20 points on any given week and a very safe floor where I know he's not going to bust week to week. I almost think that the best way to handle Bayshul Tuten is to fade him at his current draft cost and then wait and see how the season plays out, and if you get the frustrating committee in the first couple of weeks of the season, buy low on him then and hope that he gets his opportunity to break out in the second half of the season. Because I do think that even if the Jaguars are hell-bent on the frustrating committee early in the year, as the year goes on, I think it's going to be harder and harder to keep the best player off of the field. And I think that Bayshul Tuten, in terms of ceiling, is far and away the best running back that the Jaguars have on this roster. But at his current cost, I just don't think I can draft him on many teams this year. I'm going to be going for either the safety of a DeAndre Swift or the upside of one of the wide receivers in this round. At the 508, we have Mike Evans of the San Francisco 49ers. And Evans last season, for the first time in his career, failed to reach the 1,000-yard mark for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It was a lost season for Evans with a lot of injuries piling up that kept him out of the lineup. And on paper, you love the fit for Mike Evans in San Francisco. This is a great offense. The Kyle Shanahan offense is always a very fantasy-friendly one. Brock Purdy, also a great quarterback and a great fit for Evans' skill set. Evans going to the 49ers feels very much like when Derrick Henry went to the Baltimore Ravens. You could see how good the fit was on paper from just a mile away. And you could see Evans, in a best-case scenario, finishing with a very high-level season similar to that of Derrick Henry, or maybe a more appropriate comparison would be what Davante Adams was able to do for the Rams a year ago. But where you have real concerns with Evans going into his age 32 season is his ability to stay on the field. And you saw last year with just the reoccurring soft tissue injuries, and even this season in training camp, Evans already dealing with a quad injury, and it's something that we're going to have to monitor over the next few weeks. Hopefully this is a minor thing and he returns to practice soon, but if this becomes a thing where he starts to miss multiple weeks, then I think you really have to reevaluate where you stand on Mike Evans. Because I could see a world where he has a fantastic season and vastly outperforms this ADP, but I could also see a world where he struggles to stay on the field once again and is a complete bust at this pick. So if I were drafting today, I would still be in on Mike Evans at this ADP. I think that the potential role and the fit in this offense right now outweigh the injury risk, but it's also something that, again, as I said, we're going to have to monitor, and if it continues to be a problem for him getting on the field in training camp, then we're going to have to reevaluate this stance. Up next at the 509, we have Drake Maye of the New England Patriots, the third quarterback coming off the board. Maye last season was outstanding, finishing as the QB2 overall, and was also another win for those who followed the wait on quarterback strategy, providing phenomenal value in the double-digit rounds of last year's drafts. This year, however, there will be no discount on Drake Maye. You now have to pay up to get in with a top 5 quarterback price tag. The good news for Drake Maye is that they dramatically upgrade his wide receivers by acquiring A.J. Brown and Romeo Doubs in the offseason. They also still have guys like Kayshon Boutte and Demario Douglas still around that were important role players for him a year ago. So you have Maye, who has already shown that he has the ability to throw for over 4,000 yards and 30 touchdowns with a cast of wide receivers that is not as good as the one that he's going to have this year. So he gets the upgrade at wide receiver, and he's also a threat to do damage with his legs. He ran for over 400 rushing yards last year and scored 4 touchdowns. So he's just one of these quarterbacks that's going to carry that elite ceiling, but also a very safe floor as well. So while Maye is just awesome from a fantasy perspective, I can't see myself paying a top 5 quarterback price tag to get him this year. Again, I'm just much more of a wait on quarterback guy. It doesn't mean that Maye is going to be a bad pick or that he's going to bust in this range, but I just prefer to try to find the late round values like what Drake Maye was a year ago. And then at the 510, we have Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions. And Williams last season, for the first time in his career, finishes as a wide receiver 1, finishing as the wide receiver 12. And really, it was a tale of two halves of the season for Williams. The first half of the season, Williams was barely getting used at all. Weeks 1 through 7, Williams had 5 games where he was below 10 fantasy points, and 1 game that was just an outright 0. Then, after the Week 8 bye, it was a completely different story for Williams. Dan Campbell took over the play calling from offensive coordinator John Morton and made it a point to get Williams much more involved in the offense. And the results spoke for themselves. The final 10 games of the season, Williams only had 4 games below 16 fantasy points. So while Williams is still widely viewed as a very risky player, I think that Dan Campbell understands that he's too good, he's too talented, he's got too much game-breaking ability to just go weeks without being involved in the offense like he was last season. And one thing that I think quietly works in the favor of Jameson Williams is the fact that David Montgomery is no longer on the roster. And you might hear that and you might say, well, wait a minute, David Montgomery is a running back. Why would that impact what the wide receiver position does? The thing about David Montgomery and how he impacts Jameson Williams and the rest of this Lions offense is that even though he was a running back, he was a good enough player that he was commanding anywhere from 180 to 200 touches on his own in any given season. Last season alone, Montgomery accounted for 187 total touches, and you can't tell me that they're just going to fill 187 opportunities just to Isaiah Pacheco and whatever other backup running backs they're going to have behind Jahmyr Gibbs. No, instead, those 187 opportunities are just going to result in upticks in usage for everybody else, whether it's Jameson Williams, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta, Jahmyr Gibbs. Those are all extra touches that are going to these explosive players in this dynamic offense. So by having one less skill position that's going to command a significant role in the offense, it's going to increase the floors for everybody else. So I think that Jameson Williams is much safer of a pick than what he's been in recent seasons. In the past, I usually treated Williams as a guy that I wouldn't go near in leagues where I'm only starting 2 wide receivers and 1 flex. He was somebody that I had much more interest in if I was playing in a multiple flex format. This is the first year that I'm comfortable with drafting Jameson Williams in a league where I'm only starting 2 receivers and 1 flex. So Williams at the 5'10", you've got an explosive wide receiver that's playing in a phenomenal offense that's going to play a lot of games indoors. Again, Detroit is going to have 12 dome games this season. So in the back end of round 5, I absolutely love Jameson Williams as a wide receiver 3 pick that I think has upside to be at least a high-end wide receiver 2, if not push for the back end of the wide receiver 1 ranks again. At the 5'11", we have DJ Moore, the Buffalo Bills, and DJ Moore is a guy that every year I just never have any interest in. I think he's one of the most overhyped wide receivers in fantasy football. He always seems to be a guy that just gets a lot of interest, a lot of love from the fantasy community, but then just under-delivers year after year. Moore last season, in his only year in the Ben Johnson offense, finished as the wide receiver 35. Moore managed to finish as a wide receiver 1 4 times last season, but other than those 4 games, he didn't finish as a wide receiver 2 in a single one of the rest of his games. The closest that Moore ever came to the wide receiver 2 ranks was wide receiver 29 with a 12-point effort. Other than that, he had 10 games, 10, where he was below 10 fantasy points. And again, that was the output that he provided when he was playing within a Ben Johnson offense, which is one of the most electric, explosive schemes in the league. Now this season he makes the move over to Buffalo playing with Josh Allen, and honestly, I really don't see where the upside for DJ Moore is this year. I don't think he's going to be any different than what he was a year ago, where yes, he's going to have the occasional spiked week, but I think you're also going to have again the games where he gives you zero floor. And this Buffalo offense also, under Joe Brady, who was the offensive coordinator, now the head coach, it's been an offense that doesn't look to go out and feature any one player. It's very much an offense that relies on spreading the ball around. And just think about what this Buffalo offense has been. Remember that when they traded for Amari Cooper a couple of years ago, Cooper was still in pretty decent shape. He could have made a much bigger statistical impact in Buffalo than what he did, but the Bills just do not feature any one receiver on a given week. So DJ Moore at the back end of this 5th round is going to be a total fade for me. I'd much rather have Odunze, who we'll get into in just a minute, and I'd also rather be taking Mike Evans and going after his ceiling than I would settling for drafting Moore and knowing that I'm going to be dealing with a lot of zero floor weeks. And then the last pick in this round right now, Odunze of the Chicago Bears. And Odunze last season, very much like Emeka Egbuka, got off to a fantastic start in the month of September. But from week 5 on, Rome was basically unstartable. He only posted 2 games the rest of the season with more than 10 fantasy points. And there's a couple reasons for the fall off. For one, I don't think that Odunze and Caleb Williams were ever completely in sync with each other after the early parts of the season. There were so many times throughout the rest of the year where Caleb would either be late getting the ball there or would overshoot him, or Odunze just plain and simple wouldn't make the play and the ball would be going right off of his fingertips. There would even be times when Odunze and Williams would connect and it would be wiped out by a penalty. Also, you had Odunze dealing with a foot injury that cost him to miss the final 5 games of the season. But even though the stat lines were not good in the second half, I think that Odunze was really just inches away from producing at least a couple more usable fantasy stat lines last season. So in the back end of round 5, Odunze is a risky pick, but he's definitely not a pick without upside. We're still talking about a former first-round pick that's going into his 3rd year. Those are usually pretty good bets to make at the wide receiver position. Also, we know that the quarterback, the play caller, the offensive environment is good. There's also less target competition this year now that DJ Moore is gone. So for Rome to be coming in as the wide receiver 28, I think that's a very reasonable price tag for him. This is a guy that I think, if things go right for him this year, it's a very good bet that he'll outperform this ADP and finish somewhere in the mid-wide receiver 2 ranks. I think that he's absolutely a better pick in this range than a guy like DJ Moore or Davante Adams or Terry McClaurin. I don't think that I would take him above either Jameson Williams or Mike Evans, though. And that's going to do it for this one, guys. So the 5th round of the draft is a really interesting place to be in. You've got a lot of guys that have really high floors like David Montgomery, DeAndre Swift, and Tyler Warren. You have guys with really exciting ceilings like Mike Evans, Jameson Williams, Bayshul Tuten. You also have older guys that I'm going to be avoiding like Davante Adams and Terry McLaurin. There's a lot of interesting directions you can go in this range depending on your team build. I think that the guy who probably has the best combination of both ceiling and floor in this range is Tyler Warren, but you really can't go wrong with a lot of the guys that we talked about today. But I thank you guys so much for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed listening to me yap about fantasy football for almost half an hour. And I will talk to you next time when we go over round 6.